reconcile his father's wishes with the emotions that had always festered beneath the surface. But deep down, he knew his father had a reason for this decision. Paul was the first to break the silence. His face flushed red with anger, the veins in his neck standing out as he leaned forward, his hands trembling. The lawyer's words had struck a chord deep within him, and the frustration that had built up over years of perceived neglect spilled out in a torrent. "Never!" Paul shouted, his voice rising with each syllable. "How could he do this? I am his son too. Why does Michael get everything while I'm left with scraps?" His voice was raw with pain, with the deep-rooted resentment he had buried for so long. Michael could feel it. He could feel the accusation in Paul's words, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Paul didn't want the city lands. He wanted what Michael had, the legacy Celestine had built, the recognition, the acknowledgement of his worth. But in that moment, all Paul saw was an unfair division, a final rejection from the father who had never truly understood him. Michael looked at his brother, his heart aching. He wanted to say something, to reassure him, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say to fix this? What could he say to undo years of misunderstandings and hurt? "Paul, this was Father's wish," Michael said quietly, his voice calm but tinged with sadness. "We have to respect it. This was what he thought was best." "Respect?" Paul spat, standing up from his chair, his fists clenched at his sides. "He never respected me. And you always were the perfect son, weren't you? You probably poisoned his mind against me." The words hit Michael like a slap. He hadn't been prepared for the anger that was now boiling over in Paul, nor the sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any of the accusations that had come before. Paul's anger wasn't just about the land. It was about everything. The years of feeling overlooked, the years of living in Michael's shadow, the resentment that had festered like a wound that had never been allowed to heal. The room, once filled with warmth and love, now crackled with hostility. Lena sat frozen between her sons, her hands clenched tightly together, unable to speak. She had always known that things had been strained between Michael and Paul, but this was something deeper. This wasn't just a family disagreement. This was the breaking point, the moment when years of unspoken pain and unhealed wounds finally came to the surface. Threats were muttered under their breath. Old wounds were torn open, and the verbal barbs exchanged between the brothers only deepened the chasm between them. Each word felt like a betrayal, a wound that could never be healed. The love that had once bound them so tightly was now a distant memory, lost in the wake of their father's passing. The lawyer, uncomfortable with the emotional tension that had overtaken the room, cleared his throat awkwardly and gathered his papers. "I'll leave you to your grieving," he said softly, before turning to leave the room, leaving the family in a silence that felt suffocating. That night, Paul packed a small bag. His anger still burned, his heart still a tumultuous storm of rage and confusion. He couldn't stay. Not in this house. Not with Michael. Not in the village that had once been his home. The weight of the will, the division of land, felt like a final act of abandonment. His father's death had been the end of everything for Paul. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't stay and pretend that everything was still the same. "I have no brother," Paul said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion as he stood at the door. "And I have no father." Lena didn't speak. Her tears fell silently, her heart breaking as she watched her son walk away. She knew it was over. Paul was gone, lost to the world outside of Egypto. She couldn't even bring herself to try to stop him. The distance between them had become too wide, too unbridgeable. Paul turned and walked away from Egypt that night, leaving behind not just his family, but also the land that had once been his inheritance. His departure felt like the death of something more than just a relationship. It was the end of the hope that things could ever be different between him and Michael. Michael stayed. He stayed for his mother. He stayed to tend to his father's legacy, to carry on the work that Celestine had left behind. But the house was too quiet now. The laughter that had once filled their kitchen, the warmth that had surrounded them at every meal, had evaporated. It was just Michael and Lena now, two people bound by grief, by duty, by love, but unable to find the words to heal the rift between them. Michael would go to the shore, his gaze fixed on the horizon, wondering where the tides had taken his brother. Would Paul ever come back? Would there ever be a moment when they could find their way back to the family they had once been? But for now, the answers to those questions lay just beyond the reach of the horizon, like a storm that had passed, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The letter. Years had passed since Celestine's death, and Michael had become the man his father had hoped he would be, steady, responsible, and successful. He had inherited his father's love for the sea, but unlike Celestine, he had learned to navigate the waters of the world beyond the village. Michael had taken over the family's business, expanded the land in the city, and built a life for himself that was secure and prosperous. Yet despite the successes, something was always missing. The house in Egypto, the one Celestine had loved so dearly, was empty. The silence of it weighed heavily on Michael, even in the busyness of his work and the comfort of his achievements. The house, now his, had become a place filled with memories but devoid of warmth. He would sit at the kitchen table, the same table where he and Paul had shared countless meals. But now, it was just him and his mother, Lena, who had grown frailer with time. She rarely spoke about Paul, but Michael could see the sorrow in her eyes whenever she looked out to the horizon, as though hoping one day the tides would bring her son home. One afternoon, while clearing out the attic, Michael came across an old chest tucked in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. The chest had belonged to Celestine. He remembered seeing it in his father's study when he was a child. It was full of memories, the kind of treasures a man keeps close. Journals, old fishing logs, weathered maps, and a handful of personal letters that had been tucked away for years. As Michael rummaged through the chest, he found a letter, yellowed with age and sealed with a simple ribbon. The address on the front, written in his father's familiar script, read, "To Michael and Paul." The discovery sent a jolt through him. His heart raced as he sat on the floor, opening the letter with trembling hands. He had no idea what he was about to read, but he had a strange feeling that this letter, hidden away for so long, was important. Perhaps the key to understanding everything that had happened. He began to read aloud, his voice quiet as if unsure what he might uncover. My dear Michael, my dear Paul. The familiar words felt like a gentle breeze, but the weight behind them was impossible to ignore. If you are reading this, then the sea has finally called me home. Do not let my passing darken your hearts. I have made a choice in my will that may seem hard to Paul, and perhaps even confusing to Michael. The words sent a wave of emotion through him. Michael's throat tightened. He had never heard his father speak like this before, not even in the final days of his life. Celestine's voice, even from beyond the grave, carried the depth of a lifetime of understanding. Paul, my wild, spirited boy, I did not give you the village lands because I loved you less. I gave them to you because I knew you needed them more. The city lands would have been sold in an instant to feed a habit that is eating you alive. The lands in Egypto are not as valuable in money, but their true worth is immeasurable. They are your roots. They are the soil your mother walks on. They are the view of the sea that taught your father everything about resilience. I left them to you as an anchor, hoping that one day, when the storms in your soul calm, you will return to them. You will remember who you are. I left you a home, my son, not just a property. Michael's eyes blurred with tears as the full weight of his father's words began to sink in. He had known that Celestine had always been the one to understand Paul's restless spirit, but reading these words made the depth of that understanding clear. Celestine had never seen Paul's wildness as a flaw. He had seen it as a storm that needed to be weathered, a storm that needed to find its way back to the calm. Celestine had given Paul the land in Egypto, not to punish him, but as a lifeline, a place that might one day call Paul back to himself. Michael, my steady rock, I gave you the city lands because I trust you. You have the wisdom to manage them, to build a future for your own family. You have never needed an anchor, for your feet have always been firmly planted. You have cared for us all your life. This is my way of caring for you." Michael swallowed hard. He had always known that his father trusted him, but this was a different kind of trust. This was a recognition of his strengths and his stability, but also a recognition that he had never needed the same grounding that Paul did. Celestine had always seen Michael as the foundation, the one who could stand firm in the face of whatever life threw at him. "My greatest wish was not for my lands to be shared, but for my sons to be united. Do not let my last act be the thing that drives you apart. Forgive each other. Find each other. A family's love is the only legacy that truly lasts." The words burned into Michael's soul, and for a moment he could barely breathe. Find each other. That was what Celestine had wanted all along. The inheritance, the land, it had never been about money or power. It had always been about restoring the connection between his sons, a connection that had frayed beyond recognition after Celestine's passing. Michael let the letter fall from his hands, his chest heaving with emotion. He had spent years feeling justified in his role as the one who had stayed, as the one who had taken care of everything. But now he realized how much of his own pride and anger had stood in the way of healing. He had never truly understood his father's choices. Not fully. He had seen the division as a punishment, not as an act of love designed to reach his brother in the only way Celestine could. The silence in the house seemed even more deafening now. The letter had opened a door that Michael hadn't even realized he had closed. He had thought the passage of time, the business of life, would be enough to move past the rift. But he was wrong. The divide between him and Paul had been built on a foundation of misunderstanding, on pride, pain, and the inability to see things from the other's perspective. Without thinking, Michael stood up, his feet carrying him toward the door.